Welcome back and greeting MACC members. It's Laurel Hansen, MACC's Program and Member Engagement Manager, here with another episode of the Ask MACC Workforce Podcast. This is brought to you by the Metropolitan Alliance of Connected Communities. We know the human services workforce faces ongoing challenges and inequities, and this is why at MACC we launched Workforce Solutions Initiative, and that includes these recorded conversations about real stories in today's workplace. You'll find these podcasts plus numerous other resources for MACC members in our Workforce Solutions Hub on the MACC website. So on today's podcast episode, we're going to talk about shared leadership, a fascinating topic, and get to know and learn more from Mandy Ellerton, a founder at Dusk. She has personally experienced shared leadership and helps others to come to understanding some fresh thinking about leadership. So welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being with us today, Mandy. Nice to see you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and my business partner, Molly's heart.
Awesome. So that's a great start for us. Tell us about your journey. I know personally that you have come from nonprofits to philanthropy to consulting, and you've covered a lot of territory in your career. How has that path informed your beliefs about organizational leadership? So I would love to hear a little bit more about you.
Great. Well, again, thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about these ideas with the MACC community. What a great group of organizations. Molly and I are really thrilled to have the chance to talk with you all. And I've mentioned Molly Mathieson-Gruen, my business partner. I'm representing both of us in this conversation. Yeah. We prepared for this together in the true spirit of shared leadership. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. Interestingly enough, Molly and I have somewhat similar journeys. We've both worked in nonprofits and philanthropy throughout our careers, and that has given us the opportunity to work with, for, alongside a pretty interesting group of leaders. About me specifically, I'll be pretty brief here. My background is in direct service in domestic violence work. Back in the day, I went on to get my social work master's degree. And in doing that, I actually studied community organizing and became really passionate about community organizing, which, interestingly enough, led me to the Bush Foundation and philanthropy. And that's where I met Molly. At the Bush Foundation, Molly and I co-created and then co-led the community innovation grant programs there for a number of years. But I also worked on social business ventures there and impact investing at the Bush Foundation. I left the foundation in 2020. And since then, I've been dabbling in projects on a few different issues, but a lot of food and agriculture work, health transformation, public health kind of work, integrated capital projects. And then last year started Dusk, our consultancy with Molly. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But back to this question of how this path has shaped my thinking, my beliefs about organizational leadership. I've gotten to work with such a wide variety of leaders, some of what I would consider to be the best and most inspirational leaders in the Twin Cities. I've been so fortunate in the course of my career. It's tempting to name names, but I would be afraid of leaving someone out. But in the course of working with all these different leaders, one of the biggest things I've learned, this is a real top level summary, but I think working with all of them is seeing that leadership can be both visionary and facilitative. So you can facilitate your team to bring out the best and brightest ideas. You can co-create together. But as a leader, you also have a role of helping the group think in bigger and bolder ways and asserting ideas that might be bigger and bolder than conventional thinking. So it can be both visionary and facilitative. So that's been really inspirational to me over the years. And I think shared leadership kind of fits in that learning and those reflections, which we'll get to. Yeah. I think the other thing, though, that is really important frame for our conversation today, I think in my perch at the Bush Foundation and just generally in my career, I've also had the opportunity to observe a lot of leadership trends. And that's left me both concerned for the welfare and longevity of our leaders, honestly, but it's also left me hopeful that things are starting to change. I think that's an important frame for our discussion about shared leadership.
Yeah, that is exciting to hear, right? That there's optimism in this conversation while acknowledging the challenges. I also love what you said about leadership being visionary and facilitative, and how critical that is. And when it works, it really works well.
Yeah.
You mentioned your tenure at Bush. I remember crossing paths with you around social entrepreneurship, and you're always so generous with sharing your time and connections there. So I appreciate that very much.
Oh, thank
I
you.
also imagine that our members have crossed paths with both you and Molly over the years. So it's almost like coming together with old friends. So I'm excited to
that's nice. Yeah,
having
absolutely.
you come with us. We have such a big and somewhat historic membership. We have new members, but we also have members who've been in the community with community centers and services for 100 plus years. So long tenures in the MACC network. So we're so excited that you're joining the MACC team soon for this Zoom in on shared leadership models. And I just shared with you, we've got a lot of members coming, a lot of interest in this topic. Are you, we kind of put it out there like fresh thinking, and I know it's not like totally new, right? Shared leadership, co-leading, it's not totally new, but there are new things about it emerging. Are you seeing interest in different leadership models changing in organizations? And what do you think is driving these changes? And I have to assume, given the interest in your session by MACC members, that there is a growing desire, at least, to understand this.
Yeah, absolutely. Molly and I are both hearing it regularly in conversations when we mention that this is part of our consulting practice. There's a real hunger for deeper conversation about different leadership models, in particular shared leadership. So, and what's driving these changes, I want to build off of what I was just teeing up a moment ago. We're at a moment where, when you look around the Twin Cities, but more broadly than that, we're at a moment where we have such an incredible group of leaders who are working on some of our most intractable problems. Just really bold leadership that is hopeful. But I think anyone who's paying attention to the nonprofit sector is getting worried about what's happening to this incredible group of leaders. We're burning them out. I think this became much more visible as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded and the reckoning after George Floyd's murder. But in my estimation, the wave of burnout hasn't really abated. It wasn't just a COVID-19 specific thing. So I think it's coming from this issue where we're asking more of leaders in the nonprofit sector than ever before. The community needs are greater and more complex. That's a whole other conversation about why we think that is. I think the resources are scarcer. We are reckoning with historical wrongs in a way that the sector never really has before. And it adds up to a pretty heavy leadership burden, even if it's ultimately hopeful and an opportunity. It's requiring leaders to be as healthy as they possibly can to weather these demands, but it's also created a specific opportunity to reimagine leadership structures and reimagine values in our organizations. We can't necessarily change those overarching challenges that nonprofits are facing today. There's great people who are working on that systems change, working on the sector as a whole, but we can imagine how to make our organizations more durable in these challenging times. And I think
I love that language, durable. I'm going to make a note of that because that really is such a need for sustainability. It's because with MACC's bird's eye view of the trends, what's going on in our sector and the sustainability challenges, we see it being very volatile and brittle right now. So durability, I mean, we're not asking for the moon. We're just asking for durability to sustain the work we do.
Yeah. Well, and so I think the framing of volatile and brittleness, like, I think that's absolutely right, that we're more and more cognizant that that's the ground we're operating in the nonprofit sector. And I think some of what makes organizations more durable is actually an honest conversation about how leaders actually can lead successfully in really different ways. They have a wider variety of strengths than we maybe admitted years ago, and that it's pretty rare for a leader to sustainably be everything to everyone.
Oh, yes,
So,
really?
exactly.
I hope people aren't shocked by that.
You look at some of the job descriptions or job postings, and it's daunting, right? Because we wish that there was a human who could do all those things. But I think, with all that said, so considering both the challenges we see in the sector and the deeper understanding of leadership traits and what it really looks like for humans to lead, one of the things organizations are naturally exploring more is shared leadership. So whether that be practices that promote generally a more collaborative environment or the literal sharing of a role between two or more people.
Yeah.
And, Molly, go ahead.
Well, I think we're hearing that from teams as well, is shared leadership is especially what younger emerging generations in the workplace are looking for, right? They're not really interested in working anywhere where there isn't a culture of shared leadership.
Yeah. Well, and Molly and I had the great opportunity to be in shared leadership at the Bush Foundation when we created the community innovation programs. And in our consultancy now, we are delving more deeply into how we can support organizations and people like you're talking about in helping them consider shared leadership and really ask yourselves whether or not it will work for the organization and the people you're considering for shared leadership. Because at its best, shared leadership can challenge conventional expectations around work and productivity and leadership. It can be really powerful. But one of the things that Molly and I try to impress upon people is that although shared leadership may be a strategy to stabilize the nonprofit workforce, it may be a strategy to prevent burnout, it's not a cure-all. And actually, it usually takes more work. It could be more work that makes things more sustainable down the line, but it is a heavy lift. And honestly, when it doesn't work, it can sometimes be explosive.
Sure.
So we're excited to get into that more in the human.
Yeah, especially if organizations are already challenged to sustain and to be durable, to add one more thing and one more type of change, right? That can be challenging. So it's going to be really helpful to have this conversation with you and Molly about the ins and outs and the do's and don'ts and all the ups and downs of this experience that you've had. I'm sure you saw the recent Star Tribune article about that volatility and brittleness of our nonprofit sector in particular. And one thing that stuck with me was that 81% of organizations are within 1 year of financial crisis. And so
I talked to an executive director about that, and she said, "How was that news? We all know that that's true. We all know that it's a struggle out here." But
there are some different things now post-pandemic, right? The post-pandemic fiscal funding cliff and all of the things that organizations are experiencing. So with MACC's bird's eye view of our sector and with our particular 62 nonprofit organizations in our network, we've seen what you talked about, leadership, and it's not any one thing. It's generational. It's also experiential for leaders who aren't feeling supported. But we've seen since pre-pandemic to post-pandemic at least a 50% turnover in leadership of the organizations in the MACC network, and it's not a bad thing. A lot of times it's perhaps founders or long-term leaders passing the reins to the next generation, and that is necessary too. But there needs to be a good support structure for that to work as well. So yeah. So let's see. We talked about you co-leading your organization, and so we'd love to hear a little bit about what that is. Like, tell us a little bit about Dawn Dusk, and how is maybe a little personal insight. How is co-leading serving your goals, both personally and professionally? I can imagine you're sharing leadership and power in your organization, but what else are you sharing? Like, why are you doing this at your organization?
Well, it's related to what we were just talking about. Our consultancy is born from seeing this churn and change happening in our communities. That we think that grappling with these issues will ultimately make our communities better, make them more whole. They're times of transition, and in times of transition, you sometimes need a little more help. And that's what our consulting practice, Dawn Dusk, is meant to evoke, even in the name, Dawn Dusk. It's times of transition in the day. And that's what our consulting practice is about. Generally falls into 4 categories. We do facilitation. Number 2, strategy development. Number 3, strategy execution, which we see as a little different. We like to think of that as taking big ideas and making them happen. And then last, a category we call pinch hitting. So that's places where you need someone to step in the short term, maybe help run a hiring process, maybe write a grant proposal, a grant report, do some research, those kinds of things. We work with mission-driven organizations, staff, leaders, boards as well. We're very passionate about board governance and the role that boards and board members play in the mission-driven sector. And we're generalists. We work on a wide variety of issues. I think we both have specific issues that we're passionate about, but we love to look at the adjacent possible, look at how one field of practice maybe can learn from another. So we get a lot of energy in working across a variety of issues. And within that, as we've mentioned all along the discussion so far today, we're building a practice to support organizations and people who are considering shared leadership, specifically like role sharing, but also more collaborative practices, more collaborative decision-making processes. But your question was bigger than just our consulting practice and the work plans of it all, the projects we do. At the heart of Dawn Dusk is a partnership between me and Molly. I call her my professional soulmate. Mm-hmm. And a lot of I love that too. A lot of what's driving our practice is actually getting at the heart of some of the challenging dynamics we were talking about earlier. So there are expectations for how to work and what good work looks like that we're just no longer bought into. The idea that you have to work a 40-hour week job at an organization that is very narrowly scoped. And if we're saying 40 hours a week, let's be honest, for most of us, it's more like 50, 60 hours a week. But we're both at a point where, as much as we are passionate about change and justice and these transformations happening in our communities, we also want to prioritize our health, our well-being, our friendships, our families. We want flexibility to be humans, whole human humans. And part of what enables that is that Molly and I have incredible trust with each other. So on weeks that we have a heavier workload, or when, inevitably the family stuff or health stuff pops up, we can make space for one another to tend what we need to tend to. We can step in for one another. We share the burden of the work. And in sharing the burden, it kind of transforms it into being pretty fun a lot of the time. So I guess, beyond the sharing the specific projects of the consultancy, we're building, Molly put it so beautifully the other day, we're helping build our lives together. Mm-hmm. And we're exploring other passions and pursuits beyond careers at mission-driven organizations, just as professionals, but as humans.
Mm-hmm.
So our partnership runs really deep. And actually, when we stop to think about it, sometimes we're trying something that we think is pretty countercultural. And we feel privileged. I should say we feel very privileged to be at a point in our lives and have the resources to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that is beautiful. And I feel like in alignment a little bit with MACC, we are definitely as well focusing on the well-being of our sector and the people that work in human services and in the MACC network. And I think that well-being is such a critical, important thing for all of us to consider in how we do our work. And as you said, how to be durable. It's all about well-being, right? Yeah. Thank you for sharing about your organization. So we've talked a lot about co-leading and that shared leadership. I'm just wondering, are you recognizing any other changes to the power dynamics in organizations that you encounter or that you work with? Does it go beyond that?
You mentioned a little bit earlier, I think people are generally looking for more collaboration and a say on culture, practices at an organization, the projects, budgeting. Leaders are being called to be, at the very least, more facilitative, like I was talking about earlier, in their leadership style and in their decision-making processes. If not going all the way to creating org structures that have shared roles or more flat hierarchies or self-management structures, but at a very basic level, people want to have a say. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a wonderful evolution. And with skilled leadership, it can bring out the best thinking in teams and organizations. Like the challenge, though, in all of this is to avoid over enmeshment in organizations where suddenly everybody has to be in everybody else's business, and you spend more time talking about internal process, like who's CC'd on emails and who needs to be at the meetings, as opposed to sometimes the actual substance. And so one of the things that Molly and I think a lot about is how do you balance that having a say, that collaborative environment, with avoiding enmeshment. And we think the antidote to enmeshment is a combination of very serious trust building efforts in organizations and clarity around decision making and roles. So I just want to talk briefly about both those things. So first, trust. I think this is an under-examined part of our work. If you trust your colleagues and you trust that they'll figure things out, you then do not feel like you have to be in every meeting or in every email, right? Mm-hmm. But what that looks like in an organization, what are those practices and approaches for building trust? I think that's very complicated. It's probably a whole other podcast. But I generally love to get into the nitty gritty of how leaders specifically work on building trust. Clarity around decision making, that really helps avoid over enmeshment as well. So you can be really clear about how and when decisions are going to be made. You can say to folks very specifically, these are the moments when people can influence a decision. So then you don't feel like you have to be in every discussion. You know that there aren't any backroom deals happening. You know that in 2 weeks, there's going to be a clear moment for you to say your piece. You feel a whole lot better. So that's another area where Molly and I really love to help organizations figure things out. How do you build those processes and practices so folks know how and when they can influence decisions and then back off and let the work flow.
I like that by investing in that trust building and that decision making planfulness, it actually can allow an organization then to be almost lean, right? To have a sense of direction without it being cumbersome and micromanaging, right? Then you're complementing each other in terms of what you're doing. That seems like an excellent approach. Good advice. So I want to talk a little bit about inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. It's central to MACC's framework. And MACC launched a new framework recently, and IDEA is a core component, a core pillar of that. And I'm just wondering if you see like an intersection of idea with the idea of shared leadership. Like, does shared leadership and idea intersect, and in what ways do you see that?
I want to put it in a bit of a broader context and then get into some specifics. So I think people and organizations are generally asking themselves how to apply values in particular into all aspects of their organizations. Organizations are finally getting around to looking beyond programs as the sole vehicle for putting values into action. They're looking more at operations. I think we have some excellent operations leaders in the sector right now. So thinking through, what does it look like to apply values to hiring and HR, to budgeting and finance, to fundraising, to technology, et cetera, et cetera. And within that, there's a question about leadership structures and organizational structures as a vehicle for putting values into action. So more and more applying equity values to these kind of backbone elements can be really powerful. So specifically, we see that it can be a way to live out equity and inclusion values. I think as our organizations continue to systematically consider how white supremacy culture plays out in our organizations, a lot of us are reconsidering traditional hierarchies and role definitions.
Yep, there you go.
One of the best ways to be more inclusive is literally to be more inclusive, like include more people and their diversity of strengths in your organization and decision-making structures. Organizations are coming to the decision to adopt shared leadership structures as a way to put those values to work. It's really important to say, sometimes this literally leads to multiracial shared leadership arrangements, and that can be very powerful. But we have heard from people who have done or are doing multiracial shared leadership arrangements that you need to take, unsurprisingly, you need to take particular care, especially if we're talking about perhaps maybe a white leader combined with a BIPOC leader in shared leadership. There was a leader that we spoke with who put it so beautifully, and she said, you have to have high integrity conversations in those situations. We'll talk a little bit more about this in our Zoom in. There's just such a risk that the BIPOC leader could be tokenized or scapegoated in the organization, that the board could prioritize talking to the white leader as opposed to the BIPOC leader. There's just all kinds of sensitivities that need to have so much awareness about. So I think generally we're very excited about how many organizations are adopting this kind of shared leadership, this multiracial shared leadership, and we're hopeful about what will come of this, but there's a lot to be learned still.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. As I mentioned before, and as you just mentioned, your session with MACC, it's going to take a deeper dive into shared leadership. And a side note to MACC members that just a reminder to register for that October 23rd session to attend on Zoom or find the recording and resources afterwards on our website. So in closing with you, Mandy, and thank you again for all you've been able to share today, what words of advice would you leave our listeners with who may be considering a shared leadership model and if it's right for them?
Excited that in the Zoom in presentation, we're going to be able to go into greater depth about the considerations we think organizations and people should hold as they're looking at shared leadership, and some tips for making it work if you decide to pursue that. And it's all based on a series of interviews we conducted with a diverse group of incredible leaders who have done or are doing shared leadership locally, including, it's very important to mention, Irene Fernando, who is currently a Hennepin County Commissioner, but she is someone who many, and including us, would say is a local expert on shared leadership. She's one of the best examples of how shared leadership can play out in a wide variety of settings. So we're so happy to have gotten her perspective on this as well. So for just a taste, our overarching advice would be be open to the idea that shared leadership could be really powerful for your organization and for the people in your organization. Don't be scared by it, but also don't be overly enthusiastic about it either. To solve all of your problems, it might actually create new challenges. So really think through whether your organization and your board are in a position to support a transition to shared leadership, and whether the people who you're considering for shared leadership are healthy enough to engage in that kind of partnership. A lot of sensitivity around it all that are worth considering. And there have been times that we've seen organizations, leadership, nervous about, again, its durability and sustainability. But if the organization feels ready and the people seem ready, it really could be a powerful strategy in your organization. But also consider some of these other more collaborative measures, shared decision-making, more facilitative leadership. So we're excited to go more in depth into these considerations in the Zoom in. I feel like we're teasing a little bit about the conversation and what it'll entail, but it's sure to be a great conversation.
Yeah, excellent advice. And thank you for all you've shared. Thank you, Mandy, for your time and conversation with the MACC Network. Wish we had more time, but this has been such a great discussion with Mandy Ellerton from Dawn to Dusk. MACC members, remember to check out her presentation with our network. And thanks also to sponsors of our Workforce podcast, the Ameriprise and Schultz Foundations. MACC members, a reminder to make sure you sign up for our Workforce Digest. You'll get that monthly in your inbox. And with all the resources of the Workforce Hub that we built it for you, and we hope you find it helpful. You'll find all of that information and links and more, including more in this series of recorded podcast interviews. So keep in touch. We're here to support you and our network. Thank you all. Have a great day and be well. Goodbye.